Dark halls, gilded crowns, and royal tempers that could shake kingdoms. Behind the pageantry of Britain's monarchy lies a history of arrogance, cruelty, and scandal. Tonight, we're peeling back the velvet curtain to reveal 25 of the biggest jerks in British royal history, from tyrant kings to spoiled modern princes. Some were feared, some were hated, and some were simply unbearable. One thing they all had in common? They left a trail of resentment, rebellion, and ridicule in their wake. Ready to meet the royals who ruled with ego instead of grace? Let's dive in. Before we dive in, if you love uncovering the messy side of royal history, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next scandal we dig up. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? 1. King John, 1199, 1216. When people think of the ultimate jerk king in British history, John almost always tops the list. His very nickname in folklore, Bad King John, says it all. He has gone down in memory not as a misunderstood ruler or tragic figure, but as the very embodiment of selfishness, cruelty, and incompetence. Chroniclers from his own time, who were not shy about criticizing rulers when they deserved it, painted him as dishonest, arrogant, and more concerned with his own wealth than the well-being of his people. Even centuries later, his reputation still lingers as one of England's most despised monarchs. John came to power in 1199 after the death of his popular older brother, King Richard the Lionheart. Right away, John inherited a shaky political landscape. Yet instead of rallying loyalty or building stability, he immediately pushed many of his nobles away with his greed and paranoia. Chroniclers note that John was obsessed with money. He imposed ruthless taxes, levied extraordinary fines, and often used the threat of imprisonment to force payment. One infamous example was his use of scutage, a tax knights could pay to avoid military service. John abused this system, demanding payment so frequently and at such high rates that even loyal barons began to view him as an extortionist. But his issues didn't end with financial greed. John had a reputation for being cowardly in battle, an unforgivable flaw for a medieval king. Unlike Richard the Lionheart, who built his image around bravery and strength, John often avoided direct confrontation, retreating in ways that left his men demoralized and his reputation stained. The chronicler Matthew Paris wrote that John was a tyrant rather than a king and seemed to take pleasure in cruelty. His enemies accused him of executing hostages, mistreating prisoners, and exploiting widows and heiresses for profit. He also developed a habit of turning on former allies without warning, which gave him an aura of dishonesty and treachery. Perhaps the most infamous accusation against John is tied to family betrayal. His young nephew, Arthur of Brittany, had a claim to the throne that some barons supported. Arthur was captured in 1202, and shortly afterward, he mysteriously disappeared while in John's custody. Rumors spread that John had ordered Arthur's murder, possibly even committing the act himself. While the exact truth has never been proven, the suspicion that John murdered his own kin in cold blood haunted his reputation and cemented him as a villain in the eyes of his contemporaries. John's dealings with the church also highlight his abrasive and arrogant personality. He quarreled with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, refusing to accept the Pope's candidate. The result was a dramatic escalation. John was excommunicated, and England was placed under interdict, meaning no church services or sacraments could legally take place. For a deeply religious medieval society, this was catastrophic. Rather than admit fault, John doubled down until the mounting pressure forced him to yield. Even then, his concession was viewed as less about spiritual humility and more about political survival. His military incompetence became most obvious in his handling of the Angevin Empire, the collection of territories in France that his father Henry II and brother Richard had fought hard to control. Under John, nearly all of this land was lost to the French king Philip II. By 1204, Normandy, Anjou, and other key regions had slipped away, earning John the derisive nickname Lackland. The humiliation of losing these lands wasn't just a geopolitical disaster. It also made him appear weak and unworthy of kingship in the eyes of his subjects. By 1215, John's abuses of power had pushed his nobles to the breaking point. Fed up with his taxes, his arbitrary justice, and his failures as a ruler, a group of barons rebelled. They cornered John at Runnymede and forced him to sign one of the most famous documents in history, the Magna Carta. Although John never intended to follow its rules and immediately tried to undermine it, the fact that his nobles had united to restrain him demonstrated just how despised he had become. To them, he was not just a difficult king. He was a menace who had to be checked by law. Even John's death in 1216 did little to redeem his image. He reportedly died after overeating and suffering dysentery, which his critics took as poetic justice for a life lived in gluttony and corruption. For generations, storytellers have cast him as a villain. In the tales of Robin Hood, he became the cowardly tyrant who oppressed the people in Richard the Lionheart's absence. In Shakespeare's play, King John, he appears weak, scheming, and ultimately pitiful. What makes John such a lasting symbol of royal arrogance and cruelty is not just the scale of his mistakes, but the way he seemed to embody every quality people despise in a ruler: greedy, dishonest, paranoid, cowardly, and willing to betray family, friends, and faith alike. If ever there was a poster child for royal jerkdom, John fits the bill. And yet, as bad as John's reign was, he was far from the only monarch to terrorize his people or treat his loved ones with shocking disregard. In fact, one of his most infamous descendants would take the art of cruelty and selfishness to a whole new level. That man was none other than King Henry VIII. 2. King Henry VIII. Few monarchs in British history inspire as much fascination and frustration as King Henry VIII. To many, he is remembered for his 6 wives, his break with the Catholic Church, and the creation of the Church of England. But behind the larger-than-life persona of the Tudor king lay a man whose arrogance, cruelty, and self-indulgence earned him an enduring reputation as one of the biggest royal jerks in history. He wasn't just a ruler who demanded obedience. He demanded the world itself revolve around him. And woe to anyone who refused. Henry ascended the throne in 1509, young, athletic, and popular. For a while people adored him. He was charismatic, charming, and loved pomp and pageantry. But beneath this golden exterior lurked a temper that grew more unpredictable as the years went on. Henry believed kings were chosen by God and thus could do no wrong. That conviction gave him license to act in ways that even his contemporaries found shocking. If he wanted money, he found ways to take it. If he wanted power, he bent or rewrote the rules. And if he wanted a new wife, he didn't let religion, politics, or the lives of others stand in his way. One of Henry's defining flaws was his obsession with control. This became most evident in his marriages. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had been married to his brother before him, and Henry wed her after obtaining a special papal dispensation. Their marriage lasted for years, but Catherine failed to provide him with a surviving male heir. This became Henry's consuming frustration. Instead of accepting fate or cherishing the strong daughter they did have, Mary, Henry grew resentful and desperate. He insisted that their marriage was invalid in God's eyes, essentially blaming Catherine for his disappointment. When the Pope refused to annul the marriage, Henry forced a split with Rome, establishing himself as the head of the Church of England. This move was not just about personal desire, it was also about ego. Henry could not stand to be told no, even by the most powerful religious figure in Christendom. By reshaping the entire religious structure of England to satisfy his own will, Henry showed how little he valued the lives, traditions, or consciences of his people. This single act plunged England into decades of religious upheaval, yet Henry saw it merely as a necessary step toward getting what he wanted. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, initially captivated Henry with her wit and charm. But when she too failed to give him a son, Henry's affections soured into cruelty. His court began to whisper about her supposed indiscretions, and eventually Anne was put on trial for adultery and treason. Many historians argue that the charges were fabricated, yet Henry allowed her to be condemned. To the king, Anne was no longer the love of his life. She was an obstacle to be removed. The ease with which he turned on her shocked even those who had once supported his passion. Henry's other marriages followed similar patterns of selfishness and disregard. His third wife, Jane Seymour, gave him his longed-for son Edward, but died soon after childbirth. Henry quickly raised her up as the true wife of his memory, largely because she had succeeded where others had failed. His fourth marriage, to Anne of Cleves, was based on political convenience. When Henry found her unattractive, he mocked her cruelly and had the marriage annulled within months. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was young and lively, but her past relationships caught up with her. Rather than showing mercy, Henry again allowed a young woman to be destroyed by court politics. Finally, his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, survived him, but only by carefully navigating his temper and authority. Beyond his personal relationships, Henry's reign was marked by staggering greed. He dissolved monasteries across England, seizing their lands and wealth. These monasteries had long provided charity, education, and stability for local communities, but Henry saw them as sources of gold to fuel his lavish lifestyle and endless military campaigns. He spent money recklessly on grand palaces, opulent clothing, and ambitious wars, leaving the kingdom financially strained. The king, who had once been celebrated for his athleticism and charm, had by his later years become bloated, physically broken, and paranoid. Henry was also notorious for lashing out at his advisors and ministers when they displeased him. Men who had once been his closest confidants, such as Cardinal Wolsey or Thomas Cromwell, ended up disgraced or dead once they fell out of favor. Loyalty meant nothing to Henry when compared to his pride. His subjects lived in constant fear that they could go from favored ally to condemned traitor in the blink of an eye. By the end of his reign in 1547, Henry had left a country torn by religious division, burdened by debt, and scarred by the whims of a ruler who placed his own desires above all else. His legacy was not entirely destructive. He established the Church of England and fathered a line of Tudor monarchs who left indelible marks on history. But the way he achieved these things, through arrogance, ruthlessness, and a complete disregard for those who crossed him, secured his place as one of the most notorious jerks in royal history. And yet, for all of Henry's cruelty, he wasn't the only monarch whose zeal for control left blood and bitterness in its wake. His own daughter would one day take the throne, ruling with a fiery devotion to her faith that earned her a chilling nickname. That daughter was Queen Mary Warren, better known as Bloody Mary. If you're enjoying these untold royal stories so far, don't forget to hit subscribe. We've got plenty more coming. And I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments below. 3. Queen Mary. Bloody Mary. When Queen Mary White took the English throne in 1553, she inherited a fractured nation. The split from Rome, engineered by her father, Henry VIII, and solidified under her brother Edward VI, had left England politically unsettled and spiritually divided. Mary's mission was clear in her own mind: restore England to the Catholic faith at almost any cost. But the methods she chose, and the unyielding personality she displayed, earned her the infamous moniker that still clings to her centuries later, Bloody Mary. Whether entirely fair or not, her rule left a legacy of fear, bitterness, and a reputation as one of the most disliked monarchs in British history. Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, raised staunchly Catholic and deeply influenced by her Spanish heritage. From her earliest years, she had seen the destructive power of her father's arrogance. Henry's break with Rome had cost her mother her queenship, and Mary herself was declared illegitimate for years. These humiliations left scars. By the time she became queen at age 37, Mary was determined to prove her legitimacy, her faith, and her authority beyond all doubt. Unfortunately, this determination translated into a rigid and unforgiving style of leadership. Her reign began with some public goodwill. Many Catholics welcomed the return of a monarch who would undo the Protestant reforms they despised. But Mary's policies quickly soured opinion. The most notorious of these were her religious persecutions. She revived old heresy laws and authorized trials for Protestants who refused to renounce their beliefs. The result was a series of executions by burning, which horrified contemporaries and later generations alike. Nearly 300 people, men and women, nobles and commoners, died during these persecutions. To Mary, this was not cruelty but duty. She believed she was saving souls by forcing repentance. To her subjects, it looked like merciless tyranny. What made Mary's actions appear especially harsh was her lack of flexibility. Unlike some monarchs who used religion primarily as a political tool, Mary seemed personally invested in stamping out Protestantism, no matter the human cost. Reports suggest she was unmoved by pleas for mercy and saw compromise as weakness. Her single-mindedness gave her enemies an easy narrative. Here was a queen who delighted in fire and fear. Even if she herself believed she was guided by piety, the public saw only cruelty. Mary's personal life also contributed to her unpopular image. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was a political alliance that enraged many English subjects. They feared England would become a satellite of Spain and resented Philip's foreign influence. Worse still, Philip was unpopular in his own right, perceived as cold and distant. The match may have seemed logical for strengthening Catholic ties, but it damaged Mary's credibility at home. The union produced no children, and Mary suffered the humiliation of false pregnancies, occasions when she believed herself with child, only for no baby to arrive. These disappointments fed rumors and made her appear not just unlucky, but cursed. Beyond her religious zeal and unpopular marriage, Mary's governance often seemed petty and vindictive. She carried grudges from her youth, showing open hostility toward her half-sister Elizabeth, who had survived by carefully managing her Protestant sympathies. Though Elizabeth was ultimately named Mary's heir, the elder sister never fully trusted her and kept her under close scrutiny. Mary's suspicion of others, coupled with her reliance on a narrow circle of advisors, created an atmosphere of distrust at court. Still, it is worth noting that Mary was not a one-dimensional tyrant. Some modern historians argue her reputation as Bloody Mary was exaggerated by later Protestant writers who wanted to paint her as a villain to glorify Elizabeth's reign. She had genuine support from many Catholics, and her determination to restore papal authority was, in her mind, an act of devotion. She also worked to stabilize England's coinage and tried to improve financial administration. Yet these achievements are overshadowed by the image of flames consuming heretics in Smithfield, the symbol of her legacy. Mary died in 1558, her reign lasting only 5 years. In that short time, she managed to alienate much of her population and cement her reputation as one of the harshest monarchs in English history. When Elizabeth I succeeded her, the contrast could not have been more striking. Where Mary was remembered for severity and gloom, Elizabeth cultivated an image of vitality and clever statecraft. The comparison only deepened Mary's reputation as a failed, bitter ruler who placed faith above compassion. Ultimately, Queen Mary I exemplifies how a monarch's personal rigidity and inability to compromise can destroy goodwill and leave an enduring stain on history. Her subjects may have seen her as principled, but they also saw her as ruthless and unbending, a queen who placed her own vision above the lives and liberties of her people. And while Mary's reign was short, her reputation for arrogance and cruelty set the stage for another ruler whose vanity, extravagance, and indifference to his suffering subjects made him despised in an entirely different way. That man was King George IV, a monarch mocked not for piety or persecution, but for selfish indulgence. 4. King George IV. If ever there was a monarch whose lifestyle screamed arrogance, vanity, and entitlement, it was King George IV. Even during his own lifetime, the satirists and cartoonists of London delighted in ridiculing him, painting him as a bloated, self-indulgent monarch more concerned with his next feast or fashionable outfit than with the welfare of his subjects. While many kings and queens before him were accused of cruelty or ruthless ambition, George IV earned his reputation as a royal jerk in an entirely different way. Through his sheer excess, laziness, and disregard for the struggles of ordinary people. George came to prominence as Prince of Wales in the late 18th century, during his father George III's long reign. Almost immediately, he gained a reputation for extravagance. He surrounded himself with lavish parties, elaborate architecture, and mountains of debt. The Prince of Wales was notorious for dining on the finest meals, indulging in luxury clothing, and spending sums so astronomical that even Parliament struggled to keep up with his bills. While Britain was engaged in costly wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France, George seemed oblivious, continuing his life of indulgence without restraint. This disconnect between his lifestyle and the reality faced by ordinary citizens became one of the defining features of his reputation. Britain was experiencing economic hardship, high taxes, and social unrest. Yet the prince, and later king, displayed little sympathy. Instead, he became an almost comical symbol of waste. Caricaturists like James Gilray and George Cruikshank immortalized him as a vain, gluttonous figure who lived for self-indulgence. One famous print depicted him as the Prince of Wales, exaggerating his corpulence to make the point that he was a burden on the nation. His arrogance extended beyond money and food. George IV was vain about his appearance even as his health declined. He was known to spend hours fussing over his wardrobe and prided himself on his sense of style. Yet the irony was clear. By middle age, he was overweight, in poor health, and heavily reliant on laudanum and alcohol. Still, he insisted on presenting himself as the model of refinement. His obsession with appearances, even while ignoring the real needs of the kingdom, made him seem shallow and disconnected. His personal relationships also contributed to his negative reputation. His arranged marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was a disaster from the beginning. George despised her almost immediately, complaining about her manners and appearance. The two lived largely separate lives, and George did everything in his power to avoid her. When he became king, he attempted to block her from being crowned alongside him, causing a scandal that played out in public. Caroline was popular with the masses, and George's vindictive treatment of her only deepened his unpopularity. Instead of appearing dignified, he came across as petty and cruel. As regent during his father's bouts of illness and later as king from 1820 to 1830, George IV demonstrated little interest in governance. He relied heavily on his ministers and avoided direct responsibility. While he had some appreciation for the arts, supporting figures like Sir John Soane and overseeing the construction of the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, his patronage often seemed more about self-glorification than genuine cultural investment. His lavish building projects drained resources and furthered the perception that he was a man entirely out of touch with his people. Even his relationships with his own family reflected his difficult personality. He clashed with his father, George III, who was far more frugal and strict in his outlook. He failed to inspire loyalty or affection among his siblings, many of whom mocked his arrogance. And he did little to earn respect from the wider aristocracy, who often rolled their eyes at his antics while still enduring his demands for money and deference. By the time of his death in 1830, George IV was widely detested. The Times of London published an obituary so scathing that it shocked even readers accustomed to criticism of monarchs. They described him as selfish, lazy, and deceitful, noting that he had done little to improve the nation and much to drain it. While some monarchs are remembered as tragic figures who tried and failed, George IV is remembered as one who barely tried at all. In many ways, George IV's reign illustrates the dangers of a monarch detached from the realities of the people. He may not have been a tyrant in the traditional sense. He did not wage endless wars for personal glory or persecute his subjects for their beliefs. But his disregard for duty, his selfish extravagance, and his arrogance toward his family and people ensured that he would be remembered as one of the most self-centered monarchs in British history. And yet, as arrogant and wasteful as George IV was, he wasn't the only royal to earn contempt for vanity and misplaced loyalties. Just a century later, another king would shock the world, not through extravagance, but through his abdication and rumored ties to some of the darkest forces of the 20th century. That royal was Edward VIII, the Duke of Windsor. 5. Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. When Edward VIII came to the throne in 1936, he brought with him an aura of glamour and modernity that thrilled the public at first. Handsome, stylish, and seemingly more in tune with the times than his stiff predecessors, Edward looked like the embodiment of a new age for the monarchy. Yet beneath that polished exterior lay arrogance, self-indulgence, and a reckless disregard for the responsibilities of kingship. His short reign and long post-abdication life turned him into one of the most controversial royals in modern history, and one of the most glaring examples of royal jerkdom. Edward's downfall is most often associated with his relationship with Wallis Simpson, the twice-divorced American woman he insisted on marrying. His devotion to her was genuine, but his unwillingness to compromise revealed his selfish streak. Rather than balancing his private desires with the responsibilities of the crown, Edward chose to put his personal life above the monarchy itself. Abdicating might have been framed as a romantic sacrifice, but in the eyes of many contemporaries, it was a reckless act that destabilized the institution and embarrassed the country. What made Edward's behavior so objectionable to many wasn't just his abdication. It was the sense that he never truly took kingship seriously. Even before he became king, as Prince of Wales, he lived a life of luxury and entitlement. He was known to complain about his duties, avoid paperwork, and dodge the dull obligations of statecraft. Instead, he immersed himself in parties, fashionable circles, and expensive travel. Courtiers described him as impatient with tradition and dismissive of ceremony, which might sound refreshing in theory, but in practice came across as disdainful arrogance. He didn't want to serve as king so much as enjoy the trappings of status without responsibility. After his abdication, Edward was given the title Duke of Windsor. It was during this period that the most damaging accusations about his character surfaced. While living abroad, he and Wallis cultivated a lifestyle of privilege and comfort, largely supported by allowances from the crown and wealthy friends. Instead of quietly retiring, Edward made choices that shocked the world. The most infamous of these was his 1937 visit to Germany, where he and Wallis met Adolf Hitler. Photographs of the Duke giving what looked like a Nazi salute circulated widely, fueling suspicions that he sympathized with the regime. Historians continue to debate the depth of Edward's Nazi connections. Some argue that he was merely naive, charmed by the pageantry, and eager to maintain ties with Germany. Others suggest that he actively admired elements of the regime and hoped Britain might negotiate peace on Hitler's terms. Whatever the truth, the perception that a former King of England might have harbored pro-Nazi sentiments severely tarnished his image. For a man who had once been seen as the fresh face of a new era, this revelation cemented his reputation as shallow and disloyal. Even in his private life, Edward was notorious for his arrogance. Those who knew him often remarked on his lack of empathy and his tendency to belittle others. Wallis Simpson herself was said to have joked that Edward was not very bright, but enjoyed being treated as though he were special. Their marriage, while enduring, was frequently described as insular and self-absorbed. They lived like celebrities, hopping between luxurious homes in France and the United States, cultivating friendships with the wealthy elite while showing little concern for the hardships endured by ordinary Britons during and after the war. Edward also strained his relationship with the rest of the royal family. His younger brother, George VI, had never expected to become king, but Edward's abdication thrust him into the role, causing great personal strain. While George and later Queen Elizabeth II bore the heavy responsibilities of monarchy, Edward seemed content to criticize from the sidelines or complain about his financial situation. To many, it looked as though he had abandoned his duty, but still expected to be treated with the privileges of a king. By the time of his death in 1972, Edward VIII was a faded figure, living in exile, largely irrelevant to the daily workings of the monarchy he had once nearly derailed. Yet the controversies of his life ensured he would be remembered not as a tragic romantic hero, but as a cautionary tale. He embodied the dangers of entitlement unchecked by duty, a vanity allowed to overshadow responsibility. Edward VIII's story illustrates that royal arrogance can take many forms. Unlike King John or Henry VIII, he was not ruthless in war or bloodthirsty in religion. Instead, his jerkdom lay in his disregard for the responsibilities that came with his crown and his willingness to embrace questionable alliances. He left behind a legacy not of greatness, but of squandered potential. And as much as Edward was criticized for selfishness, modern history has shown that arrogance and entitlement did not vanish from the royal family with his exile. In fact, one of his own later relatives would embody the very same traits, earning global condemnation for his scandals and disastrous public image. That man is Prince Andrew, Duke of York. 6. Prince Andrew, Duke of York. 6. Prince Andrew, Duke of York. If ever a modern British royal earned the title of jerk in the public imagination, it is Prince Andrew, Duke of York. For much of his life, he carried himself with an air of entitlement, arrogance, and detachment that rubbed both insiders and the general public the wrong way. Long before his name became synonymous with scandal, Andrew had already cultivated a reputation as pompous, spoiled, and tone-deaf. By the time his controversies exploded onto the global stage, the label jerk felt almost charitable. Born in 1960 as the third child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Andrew was, from the start, cushioned by privilege. As the so-called spare behind Prince Charles, he never bore the same crushing expectation of kingship, but he still enjoyed all the luxuries of royal life. This, in many ways, shaped his outlook. Unlike Charles, who often felt weighed down by the burdens of future kingship, Andrew seemed freer to indulge in playboy behavior and a cavalier attitude toward responsibility. Courtiers whispered that he was the Queen's favorite child, and this favoritism, some suggest, encouraged his sense of being untouchable. In his younger years, Andrew styled himself as dashing and adventurous. He served with the Royal Navy as a helicopter pilot and even saw active duty during the Falklands War in 1982, which briefly earned him positive attention. Yet even during this time, stories circulated of his cockiness and swagger. Fellow servicemen nicknamed him Randy Andy for his well-documented romantic escapades and the tabloids eagerly reported on his dating life. What might have been dismissed as youthful exuberance instead planted the image of a man who believed rules were for others, not for him. His marriage to Sarah Ferguson, Fergie, in 1986 initially softened his image. The pair were seen as fun and approachable compared to Charles and Diana's strained union. But within a few years, their marriage unraveled amid allegations of infidelity and excess. The divorce in 1996 further fueled Andrew's reputation as reckless and self-indulgent. Unlike Diana, whose tragic story garnered sympathy, Andrew seemed to relish his role as a perpetual bachelor, living a lifestyle of wealth and indulgence long after he'd stepped away from the Navy. It was in his post-naval years that Andrew truly earned notoriety as the problem prince. He was appointed as the UK's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment, a role that required diplomacy and tact. Instead, his lavish spending, questionable business connections, and repeated blunders earned criticism. He became infamous for his use of taxpayer money on extravagant travel and for his association with shady international figures. His critics claimed he treated the role as an excuse to maintain a jet-setting lifestyle rather than as an opportunity to serve his country. The most damaging chapter of Andrew's life began with his association with financier Jeffrey Epstein. Even before the world learned the full extent of Epstein's crimes, Andrew's close friendship with him raised eyebrows. Photographs of Andrew spending time at Epstein's homes, including after Epstein had been convicted of serious offenses, painted the Duke of York as either staggeringly naive or willfully indifferent. The situation escalated when allegations directly tied Andrew to Epstein's circle, and his credibility all but collapsed. In 2019, Andrew attempted to defend himself in a now infamous BBC Newsnight interview. Instead of clearing his name, he came across as arrogant, evasive, and astonishingly out of touch. His bizarre explanations, such as claiming he could not have been at a particular nightclub because he was at home after a visit to a pizza restaurant, became instant fodder for ridicule. The interview was widely described as one of the greatest PR disasters in modern royal history. Viewers were left with the impression not of an unfairly maligned man, but of an entitled royal who believed he could talk his way out of accountability. The fallout was swift. Andrew was forced to step back from public duties for the foreseeable future, a phrase that became permanent. Charities and institutions rushed to distance themselves from him. Even the Queen, long protective of her children, could not shield him from the consequences. By the time legal settlements and further revelations emerged, his public reputation was irreparably damaged. What makes Andrew such a striking example of royal arrogance isn't just the scandals themselves, but the way he handled them. Time and again, he displayed a tone-deaf attitude, as if he couldn't comprehend why the public might hold him accountable. His sense of entitlement, cultivated over decades of privilege, seemed to blind him to the expectations of humility and service that the monarchy claims to uphold. Today, Prince Andrew lives largely out of the spotlight, his role in royal life effectively erased. Yet his story remains a cautionary tale of how arrogance, irresponsibility, and poor judgment can dismantle a royal reputation in spectacular fashion. For many observers, Andrew represents the nadir of modern royal behavior, a man who squandered opportunities, betrayed public trust, and left a stain on the family's image. Still, while Andrew's arrogance played out in the glare of modern media, he was far from the first royal accused of ruthlessness and betrayal. Centuries earlier, another monarch gained a reputation for cold ambition, whispered murders, and ruthless politics. That figure was none other than King Richard III. 7. King Richard III. Few kings in English history have a reputation as infamous as Richard III. His reign lasted barely 2 years, from 1483 until his death at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, yet his name has echoed through the centuries as the archetype of ambition, betrayal, and cruelty. Whether or not all the accusations against him are fair remains debated, but the image of Richard as a cold, calculating monarch willing to do anything for power has ensured his place among the greatest royal jerks of history. Richard was the younger brother of King Edward IV, and for most of his early life he was a loyal supporter of his brother's rule. But when Edward died suddenly in 1483, leaving behind his 12-year-old son Edward V as heir, Richard saw an opportunity. As the boy's uncle, Richard was named Lord Protector, tasked with guiding and safeguarding the young king until he came of age. What followed is one of the most controversial episodes in the entire history of the monarchy. Instead of protecting his nephew, Richard quickly maneuvered to secure the throne for himself. He claimed that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, the boy's mother, had been invalid, making her children illegitimate. Parliament endorsed this claim, clearing Richard's path. Edward Falvithe and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, were taken to the Tower of London supposedly in preparation for Edward's coronation, but the coronation never came. The boys disappeared, never to be seen again. The fate of the princes in the Tower remains one of history's great mysteries. Many contemporaries and later writers blamed Richard directly, suggesting he had the boys secretly executed to eliminate their claims. Others argue that Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, might have had reason to dispose of them after defeating Richard. The truth may never be known. What is certain is that suspicion fell heavily on Richard, and the image of an uncle murdering his nephews for power became central to his legacy. Even if Richard didn't order their deaths, he did little to dispel the rumors, and his silence made him appear guilty. Richard's reign was also marked by ruthless political moves. He seized the estates of those who opposed him, punished rivals harshly, and showed little tolerance for dissent. Though he did introduce some legal reforms, such as improving bail and protecting property rights for ordinary people, these positive actions were overshadowed by the aura of ambition and cruelty that clung to him. Chroniclers of the time, often sympathetic to the victorious Tudor cause, painted him as a deformed villain whose physical appearance mirrored his corrupt soul. Shakespeare later immortalized this portrayal in his play Richard III, turning him into one of literature's most notorious tyrants. Beyond politics, Richard's personal behavior also fed into his reputation. Accounts describe him as cold and haughty, with little patience for opposition. He rewarded loyalty but could be merciless when crossed. His reign never escaped the shadow of how he came to power, and public unease lingered throughout his short time on the throne. Even his coronation was reportedly met with muted enthusiasm, as many nobles and commoners alike questioned whether his claim was legitimate. Richard's downfall came swiftly. In 1485, Henry Tudor, a distant claimant to the throne, invaded England with a small army. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard fought bravely, perhaps recklessly, riding directly into combat in an attempt to kill Henry himself. He was killed in the fighting, the last English king to die on the battlefield. His defeat ended the Plantagenet dynasty and ushered in the Tudor era. Even after death, Richard's reputation continued to decline. Tudor propaganda, keen to justify Henry VII's new dynasty, painted Richard as a usurper and a monster. The image of the hunchbacked king who killed his nephews became firmly rooted in English culture. For centuries, he was remembered primarily through Shakespeare's villainous depiction, manipulative, bloodthirsty, and cursed by conscience. In recent decades, historians have attempted to reassess Richard III. Some argue that he was not as wicked as legend suggests, that he was a capable administrator, and that the charges against him were exaggerated by his enemies. The discovery of his skeleton in a Leicester car park in 2012 reignited interest in his life, offering new insights into his physical condition and reign. Yet despite these reassessments, the dark cloud over his legacy remains. The suspicion of treachery, the whispers of murder, and the ruthless grab for power are difficult to erase. What makes Richard such a quintessential royal jerk? is not just the alleged crime of eliminating his nephews, but the sheer audacity of his ambition. He was entrusted with guardianship and turned it into kingship, betraying family and duty for his own advancement. His reign may have been short, but it crystallized the public fear of rulers who place personal ambition above all else. And if Richard's ambition defined his notoriety, another king before him was infamous for his merciless taxation and treatment of rivals, a monarch who combined cunning with cruelty in ways that also left a bitter mark on history. That ruler was Henry I. 8. Henry the I, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, ruled England from 1100 to 1135. Known to history as the Lion of Justice, he might sound on the surface like a ruler of fairness and order. Yet behind the flattering epithet lies a monarch whose methods of control were often ruthless, manipulative, and deeply resented by those who lived under his authority. Henry I's reign reveals the darker side of medieval kingship, where ambition, greed, and cold calculation frequently outweighed mercy or loyalty. Henry's path to the throne began in a swirl of opportunism. His elder brother, William II, known as William Rufus, died suddenly during a hunting accident in the New Forest in 1100. Whether or not foul play was involved, Henry wasted no time seizing the crown before his other brother, Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy, could claim it. This hasty move set the tone for his reign. Henry knew what he wanted, and he was willing to bend rules, exploit timing, and crush rivals to secure it. Once in power, Henry established himself as a shrewd but often merciless ruler. He strengthened royal administration and was skilled at using written records and law to reinforce his authority. But justice under Henry was not always about fairness. Chroniclers noted that while he emphasized order and stability, he also used the legal system as a weapon. Heavy fines, harsh penalties, and the manipulation of law to enrich the crown became hallmarks of his reign. His justice often served his treasury more than his people. Henry was notorious for extracting money from his subjects in innovative and punishing ways. Taxes were frequent and burdensome, and he invented new financial tools to ensure a steady stream of income. The creation of the exchequer, a system to account for royal revenue, was efficient, but it also institutionalized the king's appetite for squeezing wealth from his nobles and commoners alike. His reputation for greed grew, and many saw him less as a just monarch than as an extortionist cloaked in royal authority. Family ties, too, were no barrier to Henry's ambition. His older brother Robert Curthose had the stronger claim to Normandy, yet Henry would not tolerate sharing power. After a prolonged rivalry, Henry invaded Normandy and captured Robert at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106. Rather than reconcile or forgive, Henry imprisoned Robert for the rest of his life, nearly 28 years, ensuring he would never again pose a threat. This ruthless act shocked contemporaries. To lock away one's own brother, denying him both liberty and dignity, underscored Henry's cold-blooded approach to family and politics. Henry's reign was also marked by personal arrogance. He cultivated a stern, commanding persona, but he showed little tolerance for criticism or dissent. His court functioned less as a community of counsel, and more as a hierarchy centered on his will. Those who defied him could expect punishment, exile, or confiscation of lands. His nobles learned to tread carefully, aware that their king's patience was thin and his retribution severe. One of the defining tragedies of Henry's reign, though not one he directly caused, was the sinking of the White Ship in 1120. The disaster claimed the life of his only legitimate son and heir, William Adelin, plunging England into a succession crisis. Henry, already known for his iron control, responded with increased severity, determined to secure his dynasty through his daughter Matilda. He forced his nobles to swear allegiance to her, but his autocratic insistence planted the seeds of future conflict. After his death, England descended into civil war during the Anarchy, a period of chaos that exposed how fragile Henry's carefully built power had been. In private life, Henry's behavior further tarnished his reputation. He fathered at least 20, possibly more than 25, illegitimate children with numerous mistresses. While illegitimacy itself was not unusual for monarchs, Henry's sheer disregard for propriety and his use of these relationships to build alliances fueled whispers about his moral laxity. He often flaunted his relationships, showing little care for how they reflected on the crown. Despite his nickname as the Lion of Justice, Henry I is remembered today as much for his cruelty and greed as for his administrative skill. His reign stabilized England after the turbulence of his brother William II, but stability came at the cost of heavy taxation, merciless treatment of rivals, and a lack of compassion for even his closest kin. He was a monarch who embodied the medieval ideal of kingship as absolute authority, but he also demonstrated how such authority, when unchecked, could make a ruler cold, manipulative, and feared rather than loved. What secures Henry I's place among the greatest royal jerks is not simply his imprisonment of Robert or his relentless taxation. It is the image of a king who cloaked his avarice and ambition beneath the language of justice, while his subjects saw only severity and greed. His legacy was one of power maintained through fear, not affection. And while Henry I's reign displayed a calculated, merciless kind of arrogance, centuries later, another monarch would reveal a very different version of jerkdom. Outwardly revered as a symbol of empire, but in private dismissive, domineering, and even cruel to those closest to her. That monarch was Queen Victoria. 9. Queen Victoria, in private. To the outside world, Queen Victoria was the ultimate symbol of respectability, family values, and imperial pride. Her long reign from 1837 to 1901 gave her an almost mythical status, as though she embodied the very essence of Britain during its rise as a global power. Statues, portraits, and even the adjective Victorian reflected her image as a stern but dignified monarch. Yet behind the public facade of grandeur and moral uprightness, the private Victoria was often harsh, dismissive, and unsparing, especially toward her own family. While she remains a celebrated figure in British history, her private words and behavior reveal a woman who could be cuttingly cruel and deeply unsympathetic, even to those closest to her. Victoria was a master of projecting a public persona. She embraced her role as a widow after Prince Albert's death in 1861, cultivating an image of sorrow, purity, and duty. But in her letters and private remarks, a very different picture emerges. Far from the gentle mother figure of legend, Victoria frequently mocked, belittled, or dismissed her children. She regarded many of them with disdain, calling them tiresome, stupid, or disappointing. This tendency was not limited to passing irritation. She wrote extensively of her low opinion of her eldest son, the future Edward VII. Victoria's relationship with Edward, known as Bertie, is one of the most telling examples of her severity. She viewed him as weak-willed, frivolous, and unworthy of his position as heir. When he got into youthful scrapes, she responded not with guidance, but with bitterness. She blamed him, in part, for Albert's death, believing that the stress of Bertie's indiscretions had hastened her husband's decline. For the rest of her life, she carried that resentment, openly declaring her disappointment in her son's character. Such harshness left Edward emotionally distant, and his eventual reputation as a pleasure seeker and philanderer can partly be traced back to the coldness he endured from his mother. Her other children fared little better. Victoria showed favoritism to some while scorning others. She frequently criticized her daughter's appearances, intellect, or choices of husbands. To Princess Alice, she could be unforgiving. To Princess Beatrice, she was controlling to the point of suffocation. While the public admired Victoria as the matriarch of Europe, Her descendants sat on nearly every major European throne. Those same descendants often carried memories of her sharp tongue and domineering presence. Victoria's lack of sympathy extended beyond her family. Despite presiding over an era of enormous industrial and social change, she showed little genuine concern for the plight of the poor. While writers like Charles Dickens and reformers highlighted the grim realities of child labor, slums, and famine, Victoria's private writings reveal more preoccupation with court ceremonies and personal grievances than with improving the conditions of her subjects. She often appeared irritated when pressed to address social issues, preferring to leave such matters to her ministers. This aloofness clashed with her carefully constructed image as a motherly figure for the nation. Even in her personal relationships, Victoria's behavior could be imperious. After Albert's death, she grew close to her Scottish servant John Brown, and later to her Indian attendant Abdul Karim. Both relationships were marked by her fierce loyalty to her favorites and equally fierce contempt for anyone who questioned them. Courtiers and family members often bristled at the way she elevated these individuals, ignoring criticism and belittling those who opposed her. To many insiders, this favoritism underscored her tendency to value her own emotional needs above the concerns of those around her. Victoria's private correspondence also shows a woman prone to scathing judgments about others. She mocked political figures, dismissed cultural movements she disliked, and could be shockingly blunt in her assessments of people's intelligence or character. Her lack of diplomacy in private stands in stark contrast to her image as a wise, restrained ruler. It is no surprise that after her death, when her letters were published, many were startled to see how sharp and unkind her words could be. What makes Victoria's private persona so striking is the gap between perception and reality. The world revered her as a moral compass, yet she often displayed impatience, cruelty, and arrogance in her personal dealings. Her children grew up under the weight of her criticism, her subjects often wondered about her aloofness, and her court lived in fear of her sudden tempers. To be sure, Victoria was not entirely without virtues. She had a strong sense of duty, genuine devotion to Albert, and moments of compassion. But the darker side of her personality, her coldness toward her children, her disdain for the poor, and her domineering control, cannot be ignored. For those who lived closest to her, the grandmother of Europe was far less maternal than history books often suggest. And if Victoria's private arrogance left scars within her family, her eldest son, whom she scorned throughout his youth, would, before becoming king, prove just as capable of embodying royal jerkdom in his own right. That man was Edward VII, long before the crown ever sat upon his head. 10. Edward VII, before kingship. Before he became King Edward VII in 1901, Bertie was the bane of his mother, Queen Victoria's existence. As the Prince of Wales for nearly 6 decades, he spent the majority of his life in the shadow of his domineering mother, who never trusted him and frequently scorned his character. And to be fair, Edward gave her plenty of reasons to worry. Long before his eventual reputation as a genial, grandfatherly monarch, he lived a life defined by arrogance, indulgence, and selfishness that made him, in many eyes, the epitome of a royal jerk. From an early age, Edward was spoiled. As the heir, he was surrounded by privilege and adulation, yet he displayed little discipline or interest in academics. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert found him to be lazy, inattentive, and careless with his studies. Albert, who valued morality and self-control, despaired at his son's behavior. Victoria went even further, writing harshly about Bertie's lack of seriousness and treating him with open disdain. While her severity might have been excessive, Edward's actions often justified her frustration. He preferred parties to books, gossip to duty, and personal pleasure to responsibility. As a young man, Edward's reputation for arrogance grew. He developed a taste for luxury, surrounding himself with fashionable companions, expensive clothes, and the latest trends in dining and entertainment. Servants and aides noted that he could be dismissive, rude, or haughty, expecting absolute deference from those around him. Unlike his mother, who projected an image of austerity and moral rigidity, Edward embraced decadence. This contrast made him seem shallow and self-indulgent at a time when the monarchy was supposed to embody moral guidance for the nation. One of the defining features of his pre-kingly life was his relentless pursuit of pleasure. Edward was notorious for his affairs and casual disregard for the vows of marriage once he wed Princess Alexandra of Denmark in 1863. Court gossip painted him as perpetually unfaithful, with a string of mistresses who enjoyed his patronage and protection. His attitude toward fidelity and commitment was not one of regret, but of entitlement. He believed, as many royals of his time did, that his position excused behavior that would have ruined an ordinary man. Edward's arrogance extended into his dealings with politics and the court. While he was not allowed to interfere directly in government, he often meddled, using his influence to push his own preferences. Ministers found him frustrating and shallow, more concerned with personal rivalries and pleasures than with serious matters. His arrogance in believing he could outmaneuver seasoned politicians reflected his inflated sense of importance. He also gained a reputation for rudeness in social settings. Accounts describe him as impatient with those who bored him, dismissive of people he deemed unworthy, and quick to make cutting remarks. His charm could win over many admirers, but those who worked closely with him often saw the other side. A man who expected to be entertained, obeyed, and flattered at all times. Edward's taste for indulgence reached almost comical extremes. He was known for extravagant meals, elaborate costumes, and an endless appetite for luxury. Stories circulated of his specially made dining chairs designed to accommodate his growing girth, symbols of his inability or unwillingness to restrain himself. For a public that lived through economic depressions, wars, and social upheaval, Edward's conspicuous consumption reinforced the image of a prince detached from reality, living in a bubble of arrogance and entitlement. Yet, perhaps the most striking part of Edward's pre-kingship was how long it lasted. As Prince of Wales, he was perpetually waiting for a role he would not assume until middle age. This prolonged waiting period allowed him to drift into a lifestyle defined by leisure and excess. His lack of responsibility gave him freedom, but it also cemented his reputation as unreliable and unserious. By the time he became king, the nation had largely written him off as a playboy prince. Of course, history would soften Edward's image somewhat after his accession. As king, he proved more capable and diplomatic than many expected, earning respect for his role in shaping the Edwardian era. But the decades before he wore the crown show a very different side. A spoiled, arrogant man who treated his wife coldly, his servants dismissively, and his position as a license for indulgence. In that sense, Edward VII's long apprenticeship as heir serves as one of the clearest examples of royal jerkdom, illustrating how power without responsibility can warp character. And while Edward's arrogance was often expressed through indulgence and entitlement, another royal of the modern era became infamous for a very different brand of tactlessness, a man whose sharp tongue, ill-timed jokes, and offensive remarks embarrassed not just himself but the entire royal family. That man was Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. 11. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Prince Philip, husband of Queen Elizabeth II and consort for more than 7 decades, remains one of the most colorful figures in modern royal history. Admired by many for his dedication, wit, and service, he was also notorious for his sharp tongue, blunt manner, and sometimes shocking lack of tact. To some, he was a refreshing truth-teller who cut through formality. To others, he was a serial offender whose barbed comments embarrassed the monarchy time and again. Whatever one's view, there is no denying that Philip's tendency to put his foot in his mouth earned him a reputation as a royal jerk. Born Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark in 1921, his early life was marked by upheaval. His family was forced into exile when he was still a child, and he grew up moving between relatives across Europe. This unstable upbringing, combined with his naval training, produced a man who was disciplined, resilient, and often brusque. When he married the young Princess Elizabeth in 1947, many Britons saw him as dashing and modern. Yet almost immediately his blunt manner set him apart from the polished formality of the Windsor household. Philip's reputation for gaffes, as the press euphemistically called them, quickly became legendary. He often spoke without considering how his words might land, and while some found his honesty refreshing, others saw arrogance and insensitivity. During official visits, he made remarks that would never have passed diplomatic filters. To British students studying in China in 1986, he warned them they would become slitty-eyed if they stayed too long, a comment that caused outrage. On a tour of Australia, he asked an Aboriginal leader if they still threw spears at each other. In Scotland, he joked to driving instructors that students should avoid Indian drivers. Each time, palace officials scrambled to downplay his words, but the damage was done. Philip came across as rude, out of touch, and dismissive of other cultures. Yet these comments were not limited to foreign tours. He frequently embarrassed his family closer to home with his frank, sometimes insulting remarks. At events with dignitaries, he might make a sarcastic aside that left his hosts red-faced. To ordinary citizens, he could appear condescending. To women, he sometimes made jokes that today would be deemed inappropriate. His defenders insisted he was simply using humor to lighten awkward situations. But critics saw arrogance, the behavior of a man so privileged he never felt the need to restrain himself. Philip's attitude toward his children also reflected his harshness. He expected toughness and discipline, especially from his son Charles. Where Elizabeth was reserved and distant, Philip was often demanding. He pushed Charles into physical challenges and educational paths that ill-suited him, dismissing the boy's sensitivities as weakness. Charles later spoke of his father's lack of understanding, and biographers have noted that Philip's domineering style created lasting emotional distance between them. What Philip considered practical parenting often came across as cold and dismissive, reinforcing his image as overbearing and unsympathetic. Even within the royal household, Philip could be scathing. Staff members reported that he was quick to criticize mistakes, often with biting words. His impatience with ceremony and protocol sometimes came across as disdain for those tasked with upholding tradition. While his naval background may explain his brusqueness, it did little to soften the perception that he was rude for the sake of it. Despite this, it must be acknowledged that Philip was not one-dimensional. His tireless work in support of Elizabeth, his establishment of initiatives like the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, and his dedication to modernization within the monarchy won him admiration. Many contemporaries described him as fiercely intelligent, curious, and witty in private conversation. His sense of humor, though sometimes barbed, also endeared him to people who appreciated his candor in a world of stiff formality. Yet the same qualities that made him lively and unpredictable also made him notorious for arrogance and insensitivity. By the time of his death in 2021, Philip had become something of a paradox in the public eye. He was celebrated as the Queen's steadfast partner, but also remembered as the man who couldn't help blurting out remarks that caused cringes around the globe. His legacy reflects both dedication and disrespect, an enduring reminder that brilliance and jerkishness can coexist in a single personality. Prince Philip's wit may have been sharper than most, but he was not the only royal to wield his tongue like a weapon. Another figure of the 20th century became infamous for her cutting remarks, haughty demeanor, and tendency to belittle even those who adored her. That woman was Princess Margaret, the glamorous but often exasperating sister of Queen Elizabeth II. 12. Princess Margaret. Princess Margaret, the younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, was one of the most dazzling and controversial figures of the modern British monarchy. Glamorous, witty, and endlessly fascinating to the press, she captivated the public with her style and charisma. Yet behind the sparkle and sophistication, Margaret was also known for arrogance, sharpness, and a streak of entitlement that earned her the reputation of being a royal jerk. To those who adored her, she was magnetic and fun. To those who served her or crossed her, she could be dismissive, scathing, and impossible to please. From an early age, Margaret lived in the shadow of her elder sister, who would ascend to the throne after their father's death in 1952. Where Elizabeth was dutiful, serious, and restrained, Margaret cultivated a reputation as spirited, rebellious, and self-indulgent. This contrast set the stage for her life story. She became the royal who did as she pleased, sometimes at the expense of others. Her first great controversy came in the 1950s, when she fell in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced man. The relationship sparked public debate and scandal, with many rooting for Margaret's happiness. Yet when political and religious pressures blocked her from marrying him, she publicly declared her loyalty to duty over personal desire. For a brief moment she seemed sympathetic, a victim of royal constraints. But as years went on, her image shifted from tragic romantic to haughty aristocrat, as her behavior increasingly alienated those around her. Margaret embraced the high life of the 1960s and 70s. She became known for her love of parties, fashion, and glamorous companions. At her Caribbean retreat on Mustique, she surrounded herself with artists, musicians, and socialites, indulging in a jet-set lifestyle far removed from the responsibilities of royal duty. While this lifestyle charmed many outsiders, those who interacted with her more closely often described her as imperious and dismissive. Guests recalled that Margaret expected deference at all times, demanding that even friends bow or curtsy when they greeted her. Reports from palace staff further cemented her reputation as a difficult royal. Servants spoke of her sharp tongue and lack of patience. A well-circulated anecdote describes her correcting a guest who greeted her with a simple hello. Margaret allegedly replied coldly, "I think you mean, 'Good evening, Your Royal Highness.'" Such moments may seem small, but they painted her as a woman obsessed with status and protocol, even in casual settings. For staff who worked under her, this constant demand for deference often translated into misery. Margaret's personal relationships revealed another side of her arrogance. Her marriage to photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon, was tempestuous. While both were glamorous and creative, their union was filled with quarrels, infidelities, and mutual disdain. Margaret's haughty demeanor and unwillingness to compromise made her a challenging partner. Even her children grew up with memories of a mother whose mood could swing from affectionate to cuttingly cold. Her public image further suffered as Britain changed. By the 1970s and 80s, ordinary citizens were questioning the relevance of a royal family that lived in luxury while the country faced economic struggles. Margaret, with her Caribbean holidays and lavish parties, came to embody the spoiled royal stereotype. Where her sister Elizabeth maintained a reputation for restraint and service, Margaret appeared frivolous and entitled. The tabloids increasingly portrayed her as a diva who thought the world revolved around her. Yet, despite all this, Margaret remained a figure of fascination. Her beauty, style, and biting wit gave her an aura that could not be ignored. She was often the center of attention, and her friends, particularly in the arts, admired her for her vivacity and intelligence. But admiration did not erase the arrogance. Even her supporters admitted that she could be cruel, snobbish, and condescending. Margaret's later years were less glamorous. Health problems, including strokes and lung disease, dimmed her once vibrant persona. Still, she held on to her sense of superiority, even as her influence waned. When she died in 2002, the obituaries painted a complicated picture. a woman who sparkled in public but left many bruised feelings in her wake. What secures Princess Margaret's place on a list of royal jerks is not just her arrogance, but the consistency with which she displayed it. From her dismissal of staff to her demand for formalities among friends, she lived as though her royal status excused any behavior. For all her charm and charisma, she embodied the dangers of unchecked entitlement within the monarchy. And while Margaret's arrogance was expressed through wit and social superiority, another monarch centuries earlier displayed his jerkdom in a cruder form, through crude humor, overt favoritism, and personal habits that scandalized his court. That monarch was King James I. 13. King James I, who reigned over England from 1603 to 1625 after already ruling Scotland as James VI, is remembered today for commissioning the King James Bible, an enduring literary and religious achievement. Yet despite this lofty legacy, James himself was far from a universally admired figure. His court was often described as scandalous, chaotic, and crude, and his personal behavior left many contemporaries and later historians shaking their heads. James's arrogance, favoritism, and lack of refinement, combined with his inability to understand how to present himself as a dignified monarch, earned him a reputation as one of the more embarrassing royal jerks of his era. When James inherited the English throne after Elizabeth I's death in 1603, he had a unique opportunity. England was eager for stability, and his ascension united the crowns of Scotland and England. Many expected him to embody the wisdom and authority of a king who could consolidate power and lead both nations effectively. Instead, James quickly made it clear that he was uninterested in the careful self-presentation that had defined Elizabeth's reign. Where Elizabeth had ruled with theatrical flair, James preferred indulgence, bluntness, and personal comfort, even when it made him look ridiculous. One of James's most consistent flaws was his habit of showing blatant favoritism toward a small circle of courtiers, many of whom were young men who caught his eye. His intense affection for figures like Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset, and later George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, raised eyebrows even in a court accustomed to favoritism. He showered them with titles, lands, and wealth, while alienating older, more experienced nobles who felt sidelined. This favoritism created constant friction and was seen as evidence of his arrogance. He believed his personal whims mattered more than merit or stability. His court itself became notorious for slovenliness and excess. Reports describe scenes of drunkenness, rowdiness, and crude behavior, with James himself often participating in bawdy jokes and unkingly displays. Unlike the carefully choreographed elegance of Elizabeth's court, James's gatherings were criticized as undignified, even scandalous. Foreign ambassadors frequently wrote back to their governments describing the king as uncouth, poorly dressed, and shockingly casual in his behavior. For a monarch expected to embody majesty, James often came across as more of a boor. James also developed a reputation for arrogance in his political dealings. He believed strongly in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs were appointed by God and therefore accountable to no one on earth. While this belief was not unusual for the time, James expressed it with such blunt certainty that he alienated Parliament and the political class. He lectured MPs about their subservience to him, dismissed their concerns, and became embroiled in constant disputes over finances and policy. His insistence on his own superiority clashed with the growing assertiveness of Parliament, setting the stage for the conflicts that would later erupt under his son, Charles I. On a personal level, James often failed to win admiration. His physical appearance was criticized as ungainly, and his mannerisms were mocked as awkward. Instead of carrying himself with royal gravitas, he tended to slouch, mutter, and fidget. His slovenly habits included spitting in public and neglecting his hygiene, traits that made him the subject of ridicule. While appearance is not a moral failing, James's indifference to how he presented himself only reinforced the perception that he was careless, arrogant, and dismissive of the dignity expected of a monarch. His sharp tongue further damaged his reputation. James loved making jokes, but they were often crude, ill-timed, or offensive. He seemed to delight in shocking people with inappropriate remarks, much like a royal provocateur. To courtiers and foreign visitors, this humor seemed less like wit and more like arrogance, a man so convinced of his superiority that he did not care whom he insulted. Still, James was not without intelligence. He was a prolific writer, producing works on theology, kingship, and even witchcraft. But his intellectualism did not always translate into effective leadership. His self-importance and stubbornness meant that he often dismissed criticism and surrounded himself with flatterers rather than wise counselors. The result was a reign marked by political tension, financial mismanagement, and a court culture that embarrassed his kingdom abroad. James I's legacy is therefore a curious blend of high achievement and low behavior. The King James Bible remains a monumental contribution to English culture, yet the man who commissioned it was seen by many of his contemporaries as crude, arrogant, and overly reliant on favorites. His inability to temper his arrogance or elevate his personal behavior made him a target of satire and scorn, and ensured that, for all his accomplishments, he would also be remembered as one of Britain's royal jerks. And while James's arrogance often played out in words, mannerisms, and favoritism, his son would take things much further, embracing absolutism with such stubbornness that he plunged the kingdom into war. That son was King Charles I. 14. King Charles III. Few monarchs in British history left behind a legacy as divisive as King Charles I. Reigning from 1625 until his dramatic downfall in 1649, Charles remains one of the most polarizing figures to ever sit on the throne. To his supporters, he was a man of principle and dignity, a king who stood firm against chaos. To his critics, and there were many, he was arrogant, obstinate, and disastrously incapable of compromise. His unwavering belief in his own divine authority, combined with his inability to read the mood of his nation, made him a classic example of royal jerkdom, and ultimately led England into one of its darkest chapters, civil war. Charles inherited the throne after the death of his father, James I. Where James had been loud, uncouth, and fond of crude humor, Charles presented himself as more refined, reserved, and aloof. At first glance, this seemed like an improvement. But beneath his polished exterior, Charles harbored a dangerous rigidity. He believed passionately in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs ruled by God's will and were therefore answerable to no earthly authority. Unlike his father, who at least engaged in debate with Parliament even if he dismissed its views, Charles saw little reason to consult anyone outside his inner circle. One of Charles's defining flaws was his inability to compromise. From the very beginning of his reign, he clashed with Parliament over money, religion, and power. He demanded funds for wars against Spain and France, but balked when Parliament sought to impose conditions in exchange for granting them. When Parliament resisted, Charles dissolved it. This became a pattern. He called parliaments only when desperate for money, and when they challenged him, he dismissed them. His arrogance and short-sightedness created a cycle of mistrust that grew worse with every confrontation. In 1629, Charles embarked on what became known as the Personal Rule, a period of 11 years in which he governed without Parliament entirely. During this time, he raised revenue through dubious methods such as ship money, a tax traditionally levied on coastal towns during wartime that he extended to the entire kingdom in peacetime. To Charles, this was his royal right. To his subjects, it was an abuse of power, an attempt to bypass their representatives and enrich the crown through coercion. Religion further deepened his unpopularity. Charles married Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess, which alarmed his Protestant subjects. His support for Archbishop William Laud's reforms, which many saw as leaning toward Catholic practices, sparked outrage among Puritans and other Protestants. Critics accused him of trying to undo the Reformation. Charles, however, dismissed these concerns as irrelevant. His inability or unwillingness to listen to his people's fears only fueled resentment. Charles's personality compounded the problem. He was reserved to the point of being cold, a poor communicator who rarely explained his decisions or sought consensus. To those around him, he often seemed haughty and unapproachable, more concerned with asserting authority than building relationships. He had a genuine love of art and beauty, commissioning works from masters like Van Dyck and Rubens, but even this patronage seemed disconnected from the hardships of his subjects, who increasingly viewed him as living in a world of luxury while they struggled with taxes and instability. His arrogance finally caught up with him in the 1640s. Rebellions in Scotland forced him to recall Parliament to raise funds, but by then, mistrust was so deep that cooperation was impossible. The resulting standoff spiraled into the English Civil War, pitting royalists against parliamentarians. Charles's inability to bend, his conviction that compromise would weaken his divine authority, ensured that war became inevitable. Even in defeat, Charles remained obstinate. Captured and imprisoned, he refused to acknowledge Parliament's authority, continuing to insist on his divine right. His behavior during negotiations reinforced the perception that he was incapable of humility or flexibility. For many, this stubbornness confirmed that he had brought disaster upon himself and the kingdom. What makes Charles III such a classic example of royal jerkdom is not simply that he was defeated, but that his downfall was largely of his own making. His arrogance blinded him to the realities of governance. He could not recognize that his people in Parliament demanded a voice, nor that compromise might have preserved both his crown and his life. Instead, his refusal to yield led to bloodshed, division, and the unprecedented execution of a reigning king. Of course, Charles's defenders argue that he was principled rather than arrogant, a man who refused to betray his conscience. Yet for his critics, his principle was indistinguishable from vanity and stubbornness. By putting his pride above his people, he doomed not only himself but also the stability of the monarchy for a generation. Charles's execution in 1649 was a watershed moment. It shocked Europe and shattered the notion of unassailable royal authority. Yet it also cemented his legacy as a cautionary tale of what happens when a monarch mistakes divine right for absolute license. His reign demonstrated how arrogance and rigidity could drag an entire nation into chaos. And if Charles I's stubbornness tore England apart, his successor, his cousin several times removed, would prove that insecurity and bitterness could be just as destructive. That monarch was Queen Anne, whose quarrels, coldness, and constant feuding earned her a reputation as one of the most difficult royals of her time. 15. Queen Anne. Queen Anne, who reigned from 1702 until her death in 1714, is often remembered for presiding over the unification of England and Scotland into Great Britain, and for being the last of the Stuart monarchs. She was, in many respects, a monarch who left behind a significant political legacy. Yet her personal conduct, her endless feuds, and her notorious insecurities painted a far less flattering picture. Behind the crown was a woman known for bitterness, arrogance, and a sharp capacity for pettiness. Though less flamboyant than some of her royal predecessors, Anne's behavior within her family, her court, and even her friendships places her squarely among the royal jerks of British history. Anne's personal life was marked by tragedy. She endured at least 17 pregnancies, none of which produced a surviving heir. This left her emotionally fragile and physically frail, contributing to her reputation for mood swings and volatility. Yet while her suffering may explain some of her behavior, it does not excuse the way she lashed out at those closest to her. Rather than seeking solace in loyalty and companionship, Anne often turned her frustrations into feuds, burning bridges even with her dearest friends. The most famous of these feuds was with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Sarah had been Anne's intimate confidant since girlhood, and their friendship was unusually close, filled with personal letters and affectionate nicknames. When Anne ascended the throne, Sarah wielded enormous influence at court, shaping politics and policy through her bond with the Queen. But over time, Sarah's domineering personality clashed with Anne's insecurities. Anne resented Sarah's bossiness, and Sarah, in turn, mocked Anne's stubbornness. Their once close friendship deteriorated into bitter enmity, marked by accusations, public quarrels, and humiliating power struggles. Anne's tendency to sulk, freeze people out, or lash out in anger turned what might have been a private falling out into a spectacle that damaged her own image. Anne's replacement of Sarah with Abigail Masham, another courtier and confidant, only deepened the scandal. Critics accused Anne of letting personal favoritism dictate state affairs, undermining her credibility as a monarch. Her need for affection and loyalty from her female attendants often spilled into melodrama, with letters filled with jealous undertones and hurt feelings. To her political opponents, this was evidence of her instability. To her supporters, it was a reminder of her difficult personality. Either way, Anne's private feuds spilled over into public governance in ways that embarrassed the crown. Her insecurity and coldness extended beyond friendships. Courtiers often remarked on her aloof demeanor and sharp tongue. She could be dismissive of those who disappointed her and rarely forgave slights. Her stubbornness in clinging to her views, even when impractical, reflected a streak of arrogance. Unlike monarchs who sought to inspire loyalty through charm or charisma, Anne often ruled through resentment and suspicion, alienating allies who might otherwise have supported her. Anne's reign also revealed her difficult nature in matters of politics and religion. Fiercely Anglican, she displayed hostility toward dissenters and Catholics, reinforcing divisions within her kingdom. Her unwillingness to show tolerance or flexibility contributed to her reputation as narrow-minded and severe. While she was far from the violent persecutor her ancestor Mary had been, Anne nevertheless fostered an atmosphere of exclusion and rigidity that weakened her claim to be a unifying figure. Even within her own household, Anne's behavior could be cutting. Servants and attendants described her as demanding and quick to anger. She expected constant deference and, like her Stuart predecessors, could treat even minor staff as disposable if they displeased her. Her inability to inspire warmth within her immediate circle reinforced her image as a monarch who lacked compassion, even for those closest to her. Physically, Anne's declining health may have heightened her irritability. By the end of her life, she was plagued by obesity, gout, and other ailments, which left her increasingly reclusive. Instead of softening her temper, these struggles made her more resentful. Those around her often remarked on her impatience, bitterness, and tendency to withdraw from those who tried to comfort her. Despite these flaws, Anne's reign was not without achievement. The Act of Union in 1707, which created the Kingdom of Great Britain, was a landmark in history. She also presided over a period of military success under the Duke of Marlborough, though ironically her feud with Sarah Churchill soured that legacy. Still, her personal conduct overshadowed her political achievements. To many who knew her, she was less the symbol of national unity and more a difficult, irritable figure who left lasting scars on her relationships. Queen Anne's place among Britain's royal jerks lies not in grand acts of cruelty or reckless ambition, but in her relentless pettiness, insecurity, and arrogance. She alienated those who loved her, allowed her personal grudges to shape politics, and left a reputation for bitterness rather than benevolence. And if Anne's reign showed how insecurity could breed arrogance and coldness, her distant ancestor George III demonstrated yet another variation of royal jerkdom, a monarch who, long before illness clouded his mind, bullied his ministers, dominated his family, and refused to bend his will to anyone. That man was George III, in his prime. 16. George III, in his prime. When most people today think of George III, they picture the tragic figure who suffered from bouts of mental illness in his later years, the mad king who lost America. Yet before his decline, George III's reign was marked by a very different kind of notoriety. In his prime, he was often described as controlling, domineering, and obstinate. Ministers feared his temper, his sons resented his authoritarian parenting, and even his allies found him stubborn to the point of self-destruction. Far from the sympathetic figure of his final decades, the younger George III was remembered by many as a monarch whose arrogance and heavy-handedness made him one of Britain's royal jerks. Ascending the throne in 1760 at the age of 22, George entered kingship determined to assert his authority. Unlike his Hanoverian predecessors, who had been seen as aloof or foreign, George prided himself on being a patriot king, born and raised in England, committed to duty, and eager to strengthen royal power. Yet this eagerness translated into micromanagement. He interfered directly in politics, cultivating favorites among his ministers, and dismissing those who displeased him. His insistence on absolute loyalty created instability in government, as cabinets rose and fell at his whim. One of George's defining traits was his stubbornness. He often dug in his heels on matters where compromise might have preserved stability. His handling of the American colonies offers a clear example. While many in Britain debated whether conciliation might preserve the empire, George insisted on a hardline stance. He viewed colonial resistance not as a political problem, but as a personal challenge to his authority. His refusal to yield contributed to the escalation of the conflict that became the American Revolution. To his critics, this was not principled leadership, but arrogant inflexibility, a monarch so determined to assert his will that he failed to see the larger picture. George's arrogance was not limited to politics. Within his family, he adopted an authoritarian style that alienated his children. He insisted on obedience, lectured his sons on morality, and imposed strict standards. Rather than producing loyalty, his overbearing approach led to open rebellion. His eldest son, the future George IV, despised him, mocking his frugality and resenting his control. Their relationship became so toxic that the prince allied himself with his father's political enemies, turning family conflict into public scandal. George's attempts to dominate his family mirrored his attempts to dominate his ministers. Both produced resentment and instability. Ministers who worked with George often described him as impatient and domineering. He had a sharp memory for detail and could overwhelm advisors with endless questions and corrections. While diligence can be a virtue, in George's case it came across as bullying. Those who displeased him faced harsh words or abrupt dismissal. His tendency to lash out at perceived disloyalty created an atmosphere of fear rather than collaboration. Many politicians of the era dreaded royal audiences, knowing the king might berate them or question their competence. George's treatment of his subjects also earned him criticism. He cultivated an image of domestic simplicity, presenting himself as a family man who enjoyed farming and modest living. Yet behind this image lay rigidity and aloofness. When petitions and protests reached him, he often dismissed them as impertinent challenges to royal authority. His unwillingness to listen to grievances, whether from colonists abroad or reformers at home, reinforced the perception that he was out of touch, self-righteous, and arrogant. Even his frugality, often praised in contrast to his son George IV's extravagance, could be interpreted as harshness. He was notorious for penny-pinching within the royal household, earning resentment from family members accustomed to greater indulgence. To servants and courtiers, his strictness seemed less like virtue and more like miserliness, another reminder that he placed control above generosity. Of course, George III was not without accomplishments. He supported agricultural improvements, patronized the arts and sciences, and maintained a sense of duty that impressed some contemporaries. Yet his positive traits were consistently undermined by his inability to temper his arrogance. His reign, particularly in its earlier decades, was characterized by political upheaval, family discord, and growing opposition, fueled by his domineering personality. The irony of George III's legacy is that his later mental decline transformed his public image. The suffering king of the Regency era inspired pity, and modern portrayals have emphasized his humanity and tragedy. But to his ministers, subjects, and children in his prime, he was far less sympathetic. A man who demanded obedience, lashed out at opposition, and refused to compromise until disaster struck. George III's story reminds us that being a jerk does not always mean extravagance or cruelty. Sometimes it means sheer stubbornness, arrogance, and the inability to see beyond one's own authority. His determination to dominate both politics and family life left deep fractures that outlasted his reign. And while George's arrogance was expressed through controlling temper and stubborn rule, another royal of the modern era, beloved by the public but far more complicated in private, showed how charm could coexist with manipulation. That royal was none other than Princess Diana, as described by some insiders. 17. Princess Diana, rumored by insiders. Few figures in modern royal history have inspired as much global adoration as Diana, Princess of Wales. To the public, she was the people's princess, a woman of compassion, warmth, and charisma who brought humanity and relatability to a monarchy often criticized as cold and aloof. Her tragic death in 1997 cemented her as an icon, mourned by millions across the world. Yet behind this image, accounts from insiders, biographers, and staff paint a far more complex picture. Some describe Diana as manipulative, moody, and capable of freezing out those who disappointed her. While she was undoubtedly a victim of the rigid system she married into, these less flattering anecdotes reveal a side of Diana that places her, fairly or unfairly, among royals who could act like jerks in private. From the beginning, Diana captivated the public with her innocence and vulnerability. She was just 19 when she married Prince Charles in 1981, and for many she embodied a fairy tale bride. But behind palace walls, insiders often remarked on her mercurial moods. Staff reported that she could be warm and affectionate one moment, then cold and distant the next. She sometimes played favorites, lavishing attention on those who pleased her while shutting out those who didn't. Former aides have noted that this unpredictability made working for her challenging, as they never knew whether they would be met with kindness or cutting dismissal. Her marriage to Charles, famously troubled, added another layer to her complicated personality. Feeling neglected and overshadowed, Diana sometimes resorted to emotional tactics that insiders described as manipulative. Biographers have written that she would alternately charm and confront Charles, using public sympathy as a weapon in their private battles. Some close to the couple argued that Diana understood her ability to captivate the media and wielded that power strategically, shaping narratives that cast her as victim and Charles as villain. While Charles's own faults were numerous, Diana's willingness to play to the cameras reinforced the perception among some courtiers that she could be calculating. Diana's relationships with her staff were similarly complicated. While many adored her and remained loyal, others quietly admitted she could be difficult to serve. Accounts suggest she sometimes tested loyalties, rewarding those who showed unwavering devotion and dismissing others abruptly when trust faltered. Some described her as prone to sudden rages, especially during the more turbulent years of her marriage. While these moments were private, they contributed to an internal picture of a princess whose charm in public was matched by sharpness behind the scenes. Even her dealings with friends could be fraught. Those within her circle spoke of her ability to turn cold on individuals she felt had betrayed her or failed to support her fully. She could cut people off without warning, leaving once close confidants bewildered and hurt. This side of Diana contrasts sharply with the public image of boundless compassion, showing a woman who could be unforgiving and selective with her affection. It is important, of course, to balance these criticisms with the context of Diana's life. She was thrust into the royal spotlight at a young age, navigating immense pressure, constant scrutiny, and a deeply unhappy marriage. Her struggles with mental health, including bulimia and depression, were real and understandably shaped her behavior. Some argue that what critics called manipulative or moody was, in fact, the natural reaction of a young woman trapped in an impossible situation. Yet even sympathetic biographers acknowledge that Diana could be hard on those around her, especially in private. The persistence of these insider accounts highlights a larger truth. Diana was not the flawless saint some portrayals suggest. Like any human being, she had contradictions. Her warmth and empathy were genuine, but so were her flashes of coldness and her tendency to use her charm as a tool. What makes her fit, at least in part, on a list of royal jerks, is not her public compassion, but the reports of how she sometimes treated those closest to her when the cameras were off. Diana's legacy remains complicated. To millions, she will always be remembered for her humanitarian work, her embrace of those marginalized by society, and her ability to connect with ordinary people. Yet to some insiders, she was also difficult, manipulative, and emotionally demanding. The coexistence of these two sides only deepens the fascination with her life. And if Diana's complexity shows how even the most beloved royals could have a cutting private side, her son Prince William has, in recent years, been the subject of his own criticisms, portrayed by some as short-tempered, dismissive, and occasionally arrogant. The next chapter of royal jerkdom moves firmly into the modern era with Prince William. 18. Prince William, modern criticism. Prince William, now the Prince of Wales and heir to the British throne, has long enjoyed a positive public reputation. To many, he represents the steady hand of the monarchy's future, a dutiful son, a family man, and a figure who learned from the missteps of previous generations. Yet, like all royals, William's image has not gone unchallenged. In private and among insiders, he has been described as short-tempered, dismissive toward aides, and occasionally arrogant with the press. These criticisms, while often overshadowed by his carefully polished public persona, reveal another side to the man destined to be king, one that earns him a place on a list of royal jerks. William's early years in the public eye were shaped by tragedy. The death of his mother, Princess Diana, in 1997, thrust him into a role of immense public sympathy. For years afterward, the press treated him with reverence, portraying him as the golden boy who would restore dignity to the monarchy. But as he grew older, cracks began to show. Insiders have claimed that William can be moody, quick to anger, and prone to outbursts when things don't go his way. Staff at Kensington Palace have spoken anonymously about his temper, describing him as a demanding boss who sometimes snaps at aides or expects them to anticipate his wishes without clear instruction. One area where William's alleged arrogance has been most visible is his relationship with the media. Understandably wary after seeing the press hound his mother, he has always been protective of his privacy. Yet critics argue that he sometimes takes this wariness too far, treating journalists and photographers with disdain even when they operate within agreed boundaries. He has pursued aggressive legal battles against media outlets and has been accused of trying to control press coverage more tightly than any royal before him. To supporters, this shows his commitment to protecting his family. To critics, it reveals a sense of entitlement, a belief that he should be able to dictate terms to a free press while still enjoying the benefits of global publicity. Even within his family, William has occasionally displayed a prickly side. Reports of tensions between him and his younger brother, Prince Harry, suggest that William has sometimes been condescending or overbearing. According to accounts from Harry and others, William often tried to assert authority over his brother, counseling him in ways that came across as controlling rather than supportive. Their eventual estrangement, though fueled by many factors, was worsened by William's reputedly inflexible stance and sharp temper during family discussions. William's relationship with his wife, Catherine, Princess of Wales, has also been subject to scrutiny. While the couple generally projects an image of unity and stability, rumors have circulated within aristocratic circles that William has a cold streak in private. Some journalists and courtiers have whispered that his patience can wear thin, and he has been accused of being dismissive toward Catherine during moments of stress. Though these claims are difficult to verify, they add to the perception that William can sometimes prioritize his own pride and authority over sensitivity. Another recurring theme in criticisms of William is his aloofness. Unlike his mother, who was known for her warmth and relatability, William has been accused of being distant and formal, even in settings meant to highlight his connection with ordinary people. At public events, he often appears polished but restrained, giving the impression of someone who tolerates rather than embraces the duties of his role. For some, this detachment feels like arrogance, a reminder that he was born into privilege and doesn't feel the need to work as hard to earn affection. Yet, to be fair, William's defenders argue that his sternness and formality are deliberate choices. He is keenly aware that as future king, he must project authority and avoid the emotional vulnerabilities that made his mother both beloved and, at times, exploited. But even this explanation underscores the criticism. William can come across as calculating, preferring control and image management over genuine warmth. What makes William's reputation as a jerk notable is not that he has committed great scandals or abuses of power, but that his arrogance and temper peek through the cracks of an otherwise careful facade. Unlike historical monarchs who displayed cruelty on the battlefield or indulgence in excess, William's flaws are more subtle, rooted in personality and perception. Still, the accumulation of anecdotes from staff, journalists, and even family members paints a picture of a man who can be dismissive, entitled, and difficult to work with. As the heir to the throne, William's behavior carries enormous weight. His critics worry that if his arrogance goes unchecked, it may hinder his ability to connect with a public that increasingly demands authenticity from its leaders. His admirers hope that his seriousness will translate into stability. Either way, the rumors and criticisms ensure that he, too, has earned his place on a list of royals remembered for their jerk-like tendencies. And while William's alleged short temper and aloofness give him a modern air of arrogance, his wife Catherine has also faced unflattering nicknames and whispers of calculated coldness. The next entry belongs to Kate Middleton, the Princess of Wales. 19. Kate Middleton. Rumored nicknames. Catherine, Princess of Wales, better known to the world as Kate Middleton, has been hailed for years as the monarchy's steady hand. With her calm demeanor, polished public appearances, and reputation for stability, she has often been portrayed as the perfect future queen consort. Yet, behind the glowing headlines and adoring photographs, Kate has faced her share of criticism. Aristocratic insiders, society gossip, and even the tabloids have sometimes painted her as calculating, aloof, or even lazy. Though far from scandal-ridden compared to other royals, these recurring whispers about her personality and work ethic have earned her a place among royals accused of jerk-like behavior. One of the earliest criticisms came long before she became a princess. During her nearly decade-long relationship with Prince William, Kate was mocked in the press with the nickname Weighty Katie. The moniker implied that she was deliberately biding her time, waiting for William to finally propose rather than pursuing her own career or independence. While her supporters argued that this was an unfair smear, Detractors claimed it revealed her willingness to prioritize ambition for status over personal drive. To many in upper-class circles, the nickname stuck because it reflected a belief that Kate had plotted her path into the royal family with determination and patience that bordered on calculation. Even after marrying William in 2011 and assuming the title Duchess of Cambridge, Kate continued to face whispers of being aloof. Some aristocrats, still protective of their social hierarchies, reportedly sneered at her middle-class background and labeled her the Duchess Doolittle, suggesting she avoided hard work and did only the bare minimum of royal duties. While the reality of her schedule was more complex, balancing public appearances with raising 3 children, the nickname captured a perception that she preferred luxury and privacy to the grind of public service. For critics, her immaculate image was evidence of careful management rather than genuine openness. Kate's demeanor at public events has also been described as sometimes distant. Though she often smiles warmly and appears approachable in photographs, those who have met her occasionally describe a coolness in person. Courtiers and palace staff have spoken anonymously about her ability to freeze people out, maintaining politeness while making it clear that real intimacy is not on offer. This skill, while perhaps necessary in a role that demands constant boundaries, also fuels the view that she can be calculating and unapproachable. Her relationship with Meghan Markle, wife of Prince Harry, further highlighted criticisms of aloofness. While the full truth of their tensions remains obscured, reports suggest that Kate often kept Meghan at arm's length, unwilling to bridge divides. Meghan herself implied in interviews that she felt unsupported by Kate, particularly during her most difficult moments in the royal spotlight. Whether or not Kate's restraint was an act of self-preservation, it contributed to an image of coldness and lack of empathy, qualities that critics interpret as jerk-like behavior, even if dressed in politeness. Another aspect of Kate's public image that has drawn criticism is her emphasis on perfection. Her flawless appearances, meticulously styled looks, and tightly managed public persona have led some to view her as more brand than person. To admirers, this makes her professional and admirable. To detractors, it makes her seem artificial and detached. Behind closed doors, aristocratic insiders have whispered that she is highly conscious of status, fiercely protective of her image, and not above letting others feel the chill of her disapproval if they threaten it. Still, it's worth noting that Kate's reputation is not all negative. Many praise her for her dedication to causes such as early childhood development, mental health awareness, and addiction recovery. She has shown genuine warmth with children and has been an anchor of stability in a family often rocked by scandal. Yet these virtues coexist with the criticisms. The perception that she maneuvered carefully into her role, that she sometimes avoids heavy workloads, and that she can be cold or calculating in private ensures that her detractors view her as less of a saint and more of a strategist. Ultimately, what makes Kate's inclusion on a list of royal jerks notable is not that she has committed great wrongs or embroiled herself in scandal, but that her reputation highlights the gap between public perfection and private whispers. She is admired by millions, yet within aristocratic circles and among palace staff, she is sometimes regarded as distant, ambitious, and unwilling to reveal her true self. And if Kate's alleged coldness and calculated patience made her appear aloof, her husband's younger brother, Prince Harry, showed a different kind of royal jerkdom, a young man who, long before rebranding himself as a global figure, was known for arrogance, wild partying, and a volatile temper. The next chapter belongs to Prince Harry. 20. Prince Harry, Modern Era. Prince Harry, once celebrated as the fun-loving spare who brought warmth and humanity to the monarchy, has over the years attracted criticism that highlights a less flattering side of his personality. For much of his youth and early adulthood, Harry was viewed as reckless, arrogant, and prone to wild behavior that embarrassed his family. Though his later reinvention as a mental health advocate and global celebrity has softened some of this image, his earlier conduct, and even aspects of his more recent choices, reveal why many insiders and observers have described him as a royal jerk at times. As the younger son of Prince Charles and Princess Diana, Harry grew up in the shadow of his older brother William, the heir to the throne. This position gave him both freedom and frustration. Freedom to live without the crushing weight of kingship, but also frustration at always being cast as the spare. This dynamic shaped his personality, encouraging him to embrace rebellion and recklessness. While William was groomed for duty, Harry was often indulged, and the tabloids eagerly chronicled his missteps. One of Harry's defining flaws in his younger years was his penchant for wild partying. He became notorious for frequenting nightclubs, drinking heavily, and surrounding himself with friends whose antics often landed him in the press. Stories of altercations with paparazzi, inappropriate costumes at parties, and late-night escapades painted him as immature and entitled. While many young people make mistakes in their 20s, Harry's behavior was magnified by his status as a royal. To critics, it looked less like harmless fun and more like arrogance, the belief that rules didn't apply to him. Insiders also accused Harry of mistreating staff during these years. Former aides have anonymously described him as quick-tempered, impatient, and prone to outbursts when things didn't go his way. Unlike his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, who was known for her composure, Harry was often seen as fiery and emotional. This volatility made him a difficult figure to manage within the palace. His charisma with the public could flip into hostility in private, reinforcing the perception that he was charming when it suited him, but abrasive when challenged. Harry's military service in Afghanistan helped rehabilitate his image for a time, showcasing his bravery and commitment. Yet even this period wasn't free of controversy. He made offhand remarks that were criticized as insensitive, again demonstrating a lack of filter that dogged his public image. His defenders argued that his bluntness reflected authenticity. His critics saw arrogance and a lack of self-awareness. In more recent years, Harry's decision with Meghan Markle to step back from royal duties in 2020, famously dubbed Megxit, fueled a fresh wave of criticism. While many sympathized with their struggles under intense media scrutiny, others accused Harry of hypocrisy. He demanded privacy while simultaneously participating in high-profile interviews, documentaries, and memoirs. Critics argued that he wanted to control the narrative entirely, accepting publicity only on his own terms. This fueled perceptions of entitlement and self-centeredness, traits often associated with royal jerkdom. The rift with his family has also tarnished Harry's image. His candid criticisms of Charles, William, and other royals, whether in interviews or his memoir, have been described as disloyal and unnecessarily harsh. While airing grievances may have been cathartic, many observers felt he crossed lines, damaging relationships for the sake of public sympathy. Even those who once admired his candor began to view his behavior as self-serving, with some branding him arrogant for expecting reconciliation while continuing to criticize. Still, Harry's flaws are not the full story. His advocacy for mental health, wounded veterans, and charitable causes has had real impact. His work with the Invictus Games, in particular, has earned admiration worldwide. Yet these contributions coexist with the perception that he can be hot-headed, entitled, and unwilling to accept responsibility for his actions. What makes Harry's inclusion on this list significant is the contradiction between his public image as a victim of royal rigidity and his private reputation as difficult and temperamental. He is both a symbol of compassion and a source of controversy, beloved by some and derided by others. His life demonstrates how even a modern royal, seemingly free of the heavy chains of kingship, can fall into patterns of arrogance and jerk-like behavior. And if Harry's fiery temper and self-indulgence made him one of the most criticized modern royals, he was not alone among the younger generation. His cousins, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, were also accused, especially by the tabloids, of being spoiled, entitled, and demanding in ways that reinforced every stereotype about pampered princesses. The next focus is on Princess Beatrice and Eugenie. 21. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, the daughters of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, have long been caught in the complicated cross-currents of royal life. Born into privilege as the granddaughters of Queen Elizabeth II, they enjoyed the titles, status, and access that came with royal blood. Yet unlike their cousins William and Harry, they were never destined for central roles within the monarchy. This in-between position, royal enough to be recognized, but not central enough to command automatic respect, has shaped both their public image and their private behavior. And while they've sought to carve out their own identities in recent years, their reputations for entitlement, aloofness, and princessy behavior have often made them targets of criticism. From childhood, Beatrice and Eugenie were portrayed as privileged and pampered. Growing up with the protective attention of their mother, Sarah Ferguson, and their father, Prince Andrew, they were sometimes described as indulged rather than disciplined. The tabloids wasted no time labeling them as spoiled. By their teenage years, reports emerged of diva-like behavior toward staff and an apparent lack of appreciation for the comforts of royal life. Former aides whispered that the princesses could be demanding and dismissive, expecting deference without offering warmth in return. Their public image suffered further as they became adults. Without the clear path of duty and service expected of William and Harry, Beatrice and Eugenie were often portrayed as coasting on their royal titles while enjoying luxury. Their attendance at parties, holidays in exclusive resorts, and high-end shopping sprees became tabloid fodder. While many young people in their social class lived similar lifestyles, the fact that Beatrice and Eugenie carried royal titles made their behavior seem especially entitled. The perception grew that they enjoyed the perks of royalty without the burdens. Their fashion choices also became a symbol of their detachment. At Prince William and Kate Middleton's wedding in 2011, Beatrice's flamboyant hat drew ridicule worldwide, becoming a meme and an emblem of perceived royal frivolity. Though fashion is harmless in itself, the hat controversy captured the public mood. Here were two princesses seemingly out of touch with ordinary people, indulging in spectacle for spectacle's sake. The criticism may have been unfair, but it solidified their image as figures more concerned with appearances than with meaningful contribution. Reports from within palace circles added fuel to this reputation. Staff and courtiers sometimes describe Beatrice and Eugenie as expecting privileges without question, insisting on protocol, demanding certain accommodations, or showing disdain for menial details. While such behavior may have been common among royals historically, in the modern age of public scrutiny, it was interpreted as arrogance. Their critics saw them as embodying every negative stereotype of pampered princesses. It is worth noting, however, that the sisters have worked to reshape their image. Beatrice pursued a career in finance and business, while Eugenie became involved in art and philanthropy. Both have supported charities, especially causes related to health and young people. Yet even these efforts have not fully erased the perception that they rely heavily on royal connections to secure positions and influence. Their professional lives often appear cushioned by privilege, making it difficult for the public to view them as relatable. Their relationships with the media have also been complicated. Unlike William and Harry, who endured constant press coverage, Beatrice and Eugenie sometimes appeared to resent the attention they did receive, accusing journalists of being unfair. Yet they also sought publicity for charitable initiatives and lifestyle projects, a contradiction that left them open to charges of hypocrisy. To some observers, they wanted the benefits of fame without the scrutiny that inevitably accompanies it. In fairness, Beatrice and Eugenie did not choose to be born into royalty, and much of the criticism they have endured comes from the public's shifting expectations of what modern royals should be. But perception matters. To many Britons, the two princesses exemplify entitlement without responsibility. Their occasional tone-deaf remarks, their reliance on status, and their history of lavish lifestyles ensure that they remain figures associated with royal arrogance. Ultimately, Beatrice and Eugenie illustrate how even secondary royals, those far from the throne, can embody jerk-like tendencies in the eyes of the public. Their stories show that the monarchy's struggles with entitlement are not confined to kings and queens, but can extend to anyone who grows up in its gilded bubble. And if the York princesses became symbols of modern royal indulgence, the medieval monarchy had its own figure of weakness and dismissiveness. Long before the tabloids, King Henry VI was criticized for his inability to lead, his passivity, and his tendency to alienate allies through neglect and indecision. The spotlight now turns to Henry VI. 22. Henry VI. Among England's long line of monarchs, Henry VI stands out not for cruelty or extravagance, but for a different kind of royal jerkdom, weakness, indecision, and a dismissive inability to govern effectively. Ruling in two stretches between 1422 and 1461, and again from 1470 to 1471, Henry's reign was marked by political chaos, military defeat, and civil war. While some historians portray him as pious and well-meaning, his contemporaries and successors often saw him as a liability, passive, incompetent, and frustratingly out of touch with the realities of kingship. His reign ultimately plunged England into one of its bloodiest conflicts, the Wars of the Roses, and many of his subjects considered him a monarch who failed them at every turn. Henry became king at just 9 months old after the death of his father, Henry V, the celebrated warrior king who had triumphed at Agincourt. The contrast between father and son could not have been starker. Where Henry V embodied vigor and martial prowess, Henry VI grew into a man who seemed unsuited to rule. He was mild, devout, and more interested in prayer and learning than in governance or warfare. While personal piety is admirable in an individual, in a medieval king it was often interpreted as weakness, and Henry's inability to take decisive action allowed rivals and factions to flourish unchecked. One of Henry's most glaring failures was his handling of the 100 Years' War. By the time he came of age, England's position in France was precarious, but under his rule, the situation deteriorated dramatically. Key territories, including Normandy, were lost, and the final collapse of English claims in France humiliated the nation. Instead of inspiring his troops or rallying his nobles, Henry often seemed detached from military affairs. Chroniclers described him as passive, uninterested in strategy, and unwilling to hold his commanders accountable. To those who had basked in the glory of Henry V's victories, Henry VI appeared not just incompetent, but insulting to his father's memory. At home, Henry's inability to manage his nobles created an atmosphere of constant strife. The great magnates of England feuded bitterly, vying for power and influence in the vacuum of royal authority. Rather than stepping in to arbitrate or assert control, Henry often ignored disputes or allowed favorites to dominate, alienating other factions. His reliance on unpopular advisors, such as William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, and Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, deepened resentment. To many of his nobles, Henry was not merely weak, but dismissive, seemingly indifferent to the grievances tearing the kingdom apart. Henry's marriage to Margaret of Anjou in 1445 also became a source of tension. Margaret was strong-willed and politically active, filling the void left by her husband's passivity. While she fought to protect the Lancastrian cause, her assertiveness was resented by many nobles who blamed her influence for unpopular policies and humiliating concessions to France. Henry, meanwhile, appeared content to let her shoulder the burden of leadership. To his critics, this was the ultimate dereliction of royal duty. The king seemed more like a monk than a monarch, happy to retreat into prayer while his kingdom burned around him. Adding to the instability were Henry's episodes of mental illness, which at times left him completely incapacitated. During one prolonged breakdown, he failed to respond to the birth of his son, Edward of Westminster, or to events around him, sitting silent and vacant. While his illness was tragic, his refusal, or inability, to prepare for governance in such times worsened the crisis. Nobles seized on his weakness to press their claims, and rivalries spiraled into open conflict. For ordinary people, the king's passivity and dismissiveness created suffering on an unprecedented scale. Ultimately, Henry's reign collapsed into civil war. The Wars of the Roses, fought between the houses of Lancaster and York, were fueled in large part by the perception that Henry could not or would not rule effectively. His inability to control his nobles, his disastrous military record, and his detachment from governance created the conditions for decades of bloodshed. While later generations might view him with pity, his contemporaries often regarded him as a failure who doomed his dynasty. Henry VI's place on a list of royal jerks is not about cruelty or malice. Rather, it stems from his failure to meet even the most basic expectations of kingship. His passivity alienated allies, his favoritism angered nobles, and his detachment from both war and governance left his people in chaos. He may have been personally pious and kind in private life, but to a nation that needed leadership, he seemed arrogant in his refusal to engage with reality. If Henry VI represented the perils of weakness, another royal of his bloodline demonstrated the opposite problem: excessive pride and arrogance in pursuing power. His daughter Matilda, who claimed the throne during a turbulent civil war, became infamous for her own brand of jerkishness, marked not by passivity, but by open contempt toward allies and rivals alike. The story now turns to Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry the 23. Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I. Empress Matilda, daughter of King Henry I, and claimant to the English throne during the mid-12th century, is remembered as one of the most formidable women in medieval Europe. Intelligent, ambitious, and politically shrewd, she fought fiercely for her right to rule after her father's death. Yet alongside these qualities came arrogance, haughtiness, and a dismissive attitude that alienated many of her supporters. While she was never officially crowned queen, her actions during the period of civil war known as the Anarchy left her with a reputation for imperious behavior that, fairly or not, has secured her a place among Britain's royal jerks. Matilda's claim to the throne stemmed from her father, Henry I, who named her his heir after the death of his only legitimate son in the White Ship disaster of 1120. Henry compelled his barons to swear loyalty to Matilda, but many had little enthusiasm for the idea of a female monarch. When Henry died in 1135, his nephew Stephen of Blois quickly seized the throne, plunging England into nearly 2 decades of conflict between the factions loyal to Stephen and those supporting Matilda. From the start, Matilda's determination was unmistakable. Unlike Henry VI, centuries later, she was no passive figure. She demanded recognition of her rights and rallied powerful allies, including her half-brother Robert of Gloucester and her uncle David I of Scotland. Her cause was strong enough to threaten Stephen's position, and for a time she seemed poised to triumph. Yet even at the height of her success, Matilda's personality undermined her chances. One of the most telling episodes occurred in 1141, when Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln, and Matilda suddenly held the upper hand. She entered London preparing for her coronation, but instead of consolidating support through magnanimity, she displayed open arrogance. Chroniclers record that she alienated potential allies by demanding money from citizens, refusing to listen to advice, and treating nobles with disdain. Where her father had combined firmness with pragmatism, Matilda seemed unable to temper her pride. Her treatment of her supporters further eroded her standing. Matilda was known for her sharp tongue and imperious manner, qualities that grated on the barons who had risked much to support her. She often failed to reward loyalty adequately, leaving allies feeling taken for granted. Even her closest confidants remarked on her tendency to act as though obedience was her due rather than something to be earned. This sense of entitlement reflected her conviction that, as her father's chosen heir, her authority should never have been questioned in the first place. Contemporary chroniclers, many of them hostile to female authority, emphasized Matilda's arrogance in their accounts. They described her as haughty, insolent, and contemptuous of those around her. While these descriptions were undoubtedly colored by misogyny, there is no denying that Matilda's behavior contributed to her difficulties. She seemed incapable of the kind of political charm or compromise that might have solidified her rule. Instead, she projected superiority, which in turn fostered resentment. Her downfall came swiftly after her ill-fated stay in London. When the citizens rose against her, outraged by her demands, she was forced to flee the city in haste. The opportunity to be crowned slipped away, and Stephen eventually regained the upper hand. Though the conflict dragged on for years, Matilda never again came so close to securing the throne. Ultimately, she retreated to Normandy, leaving the fight to her son, Henry, who would become Henry II and establish the Plantagenet dynasty. In hindsight, Matilda's story is both tragic and instructive. She had the intelligence, lineage, and determination to rule, but her inability to temper her pride cost her the crown. Her haughtiness may have been amplified by the sexism of her age, but even sympathetic historians admit that her demeanor alienated many who might otherwise have stood by her. By treating supporters as subordinates and displaying open contempt toward rivals, she undermined her cause at the very moment it had momentum. What makes Matilda a candidate for royal jerkdom is not her ambition. Ambition was essential in her position, but the way she wielded it. Instead of building alliances, she burned bridges. Instead of inspiring loyalty, she demanded it. Her story shows how arrogance, even when rooted in legitimate grievance, can undo even the strongest claim. Still, her legacy endured through her son Henry II, whose reign restored stability to England. In this sense, she achieved a form of victory, though indirectly. Yet her personal reputation remains stained by the accounts of her imperiousness and disdain. And if Matilda's arrogance alienated allies in the 12th century, another monarch, just a generation earlier, had already set the tone for royal jerkdom with his irreverence, overtaxing, and mockery of church and nobility. That king was William II, known as William Rufus. 24. King William II, William Rufus. King William II, better known as William Rufus for his ruddy complexion and fiery temperament, reigned from 1087 until his mysterious death in 1100. The third son of William the Conqueror, he inherited the English crown after his father's death, while his elder brother Robert received Normandy. History remembers Rufus as one of the most arrogant, irreverent, and unpopular of England's medieval kings. His reputation for mocking the church, overtaxing his nobles, and living a life of excess ensured he was despised by chroniclers and resented by many of his subjects. In fact, his sudden demise in a hunting accident in the New Forest was met not with widespread mourning, but with relief, a testament to just how little he was admired. William Rufus's reign began amid suspicion. He was not his father's first choice as heir, and his accession caused friction with his brothers, especially Robert. Almost immediately, Rufus faced rebellions from barons who supported Robert's claim. Instead of trying to reconcile, Rufus leaned on heavy taxation to raise armies and punish his enemies. His methods of extracting wealth from the kingdom set a tone for his rule: arbitrary, harsh, and self-serving. Nobles complained bitterly of his greed, while ordinary people bore the burden of new levies to fund his campaigns and his extravagant lifestyle. One of the sharpest criticisms of William Rufus came from the church. Medieval chroniclers, many of whom were monks, painted him as irreligious and even blasphemous. He was accused of mocking priests, dismissing church councils, and showing open contempt for religious customs. He delayed appointing bishops so he could siphon off the revenues of vacant sees, treating spiritual offices as personal piggy banks. His clashes with Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury became legendary. Rufus resisted reform, ridiculed Anselm's attempts to uphold spiritual independence, and exiled him at one point. To clerics, Rufus was not just a poor king, but a dangerous example of irreverence bordering on sacrilege. Beyond taxation and religion, Rufus's personality fueled his poor reputation. Accounts describe him as arrogant, quick-tempered, and dismissive of those beneath him. His court was notorious for its excess, filled with feasting, luxury, and frivolity. While his father William the Conqueror had maintained a disciplined image of strength, Rufus embraced decadence. This contrast underscored his flaws. He seemed less a serious monarch and more a spoiled ruler, living for pleasure. William's treatment of his nobles further tarnished his image. He often ignored traditional obligations of lordship, demanding loyalty and service without offering protection or justice in return. His constant need for money led him to exploit feudal rights and invent new exactions. Chroniclers accused him of showing contempt for the very people whose support he needed most, alienating allies who might otherwise have been loyal. The mystery of his death only added to his reputation. In 1100, while hunting in the New Forest, Rufus was struck by an arrow, supposedly by accident, though suspicions of foul play have lingered ever since. What is telling is not just how he died, but how people reacted. Instead of plunging the kingdom into mourning, his death seemed almost a relief. His younger brother Henry seized the crown quickly, and chroniclers wrote of Rufus's passing with little sorrow, as though England had been freed from a burden. The lack of grief reflects how disliked Rufus was, even by the standards of a harsh medieval age. Still, it would be simplistic to say Rufus was entirely without strengths. He maintained order in England, defended it against external threats, and expanded royal authority. Yet even these achievements were overshadowed by his arrogance and irreverence, his mockery of the church, his endless appetite for money, and his contempt for tradition ensured that few remembered him fondly. To later generations, he became a symbol of what happens when kingship is reduced to greed and indulgence. William Rufus's legacy as a royal jerk lies in the consistency with which he offended every major constituency of his time, nobles, clergy, and commoners alike. He ruled as though power entitled him to do as he pleased, without care for loyalty, reverence, or justice. His death may remain mysterious, but his reputation is clear. An arrogant king whose reign alienated nearly everyone around him. And if William Rufus embodied medieval arrogance through irreverence and excess, a much more recent royal would demonstrate jerkdom through aloofness, entitlement, and impatience in the modern spotlight. That royal is none other than Prince Charles, now King Charles III, 25. Prince Charles, now King Charles III. Long before he finally ascended the throne in 2022 as King Charles III, Prince Charles had spent decades as one of the most scrutinized royals in history. His life has been marked by duty, controversy, and relentless public attention. While some view him as thoughtful, intelligent, and ahead of his time on issues like environmentalism, others see him as aloof, entitled, and prone to arrogance. From his troubled marriage to Princess Diana to his sometimes prickly demeanor in public, Charles has often come across as a royal who believes the world ought to bend to him, a reputation that cements his place on any list of British royals who could be considered jerks. Charles's early life set the stage for his complex personality. As the eldest son of Queen Elizabeth II, he was groomed for kingship from childhood. Yet rather than inspiring admiration, his manner often struck people as stiff and condescending. Unlike his mother, who cultivated an image of quiet dignity, Charles appeared impatient, irritable, and occasionally pompous. His clipped tone in interviews and his tendency to lecture on topics of personal interest contributed to an image of superiority. Admirers called him intellectual and principled, but detractors saw him as out of touch and self-important. The most enduring stain on Charles's reputation came from his marriage to Diana. Their union, celebrated in 1981 as a fairy tale wedding, quickly collapsed into bitterness. Charles's long-standing relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles haunted the marriage, and when it became public, his aloofness toward Diana appeared heartless. The contrast between Diana's warmth and Charles's stiffness could not have been starker. To the public, Diana was the compassionate victim, while Charles seemed cold and unfaithful. Even decades later, many still view his behavior during the marriage as emblematic of selfishness and arrogance. Charles's impatience has also been visible in smaller but telling moments. He has often been caught on camera displaying irritation during public duties. In one notorious incident shortly after becoming king, he snapped at aides over a faulty pen during a signing ceremony, a moment that quickly went viral. Though minor, such flashes of temper reinforced the long-standing perception that Charles can be petulant and quick to anger when things don't go his way. Within his household, Charles has been described as demanding and difficult to work for. Former staff have spoken of his exacting standards and sometimes unreasonable expectations, painting a picture of a man who expects perfection in every detail of his comfort and schedule. To critics, this borders on entitlement, proof that Charles, even more than other royals, struggles to see himself as anything other than the center of the universe. Yet to be fair, Charles has shown qualities that complicate this reputation. He has been a vocal advocate for environmental issues since the 1970s, long before climate change became a mainstream concern. His charitable work through the Prince's Trust has helped countless young people. He is also deeply knowledgeable about architecture, history, and conservation. These interests reflect sincerity, but his tendency to lecture about them in a didactic, superior tone has often undermined his message. Even when he is right, he can come across as sanctimonious. Charles's jerk reputation, then, lies less in outrageous scandal and more in personality traits that make him seem disconnected from ordinary people. His aloofness, irritability, and history of selfish choices in his personal life combine to paint a portrait of a man who, despite his intelligence and good intentions, often alienates those around him. Now that he is king, his challenge is to temper these flaws and present himself as a unifying figure. But whether or not he succeeds, the long trail of criticism behind him ensures that his legacy will always include a streak of arrogance and entitlement. And with Charles, the 25th name on this list, we close the catalog of Britain's most notorious royal jerks, a collection of rulers and princes, queens and princesses, who remind us that power and privilege often bring out not the best, but the worst in human behavior.